All right. Welcome, everyone, to our series on cross-sector approaches to oncology. My name is Greg Chittum. I'm partner and managing director here at Health Advances, a healthcare-only strategy consulting firm that works across biopharma, diagnostics and precision medicine, medical devices and digital health, and spend a lot of time in oncology. I'm excited to have with me Ned and Jeff, who will be having an interesting discussion on this topic. Ned, do you want to give a quick introduction to yourself?
Sure thing, happy to. Hi, everyone. I'm Ned Whittish, Vice President at Health Advances. I'm a PhD scientist by training, and I co-lead our biopharma oncology practice as well as our biopharma cell and gene therapy practice. So much of my time is spent thinking about how to maximize the value of early stage, exciting platform technologies with a lot of their own inherent challenges.
And how about you, Jeff?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Greg. My name's Jeff Abraham. I'm a partner. I co-lead the digital health IT practice along with Greg. I tend to focus more on things that touch patients and physicians as part of clinical care. And so as Ned works on early with oncology companies, I tend to come in more towards the middle, later stage plannings of their product launches, more around how can digital health technologies support biopharma.
Great. And to start off, I'd love to start talking about the rapid increase we've seen in the past few years post-COVID in the use of remote patient monitoring in oncology specifically. And RPM broadly is reaching an inflection point. It's a use case that is becoming common enough and perceived as useful enough that it's being driven by providers, by hospitals, by oncology centers, and not just something that vendors are having to solely push. And at the same time, it's on the radar of payers and of CMS that are really starting to scrutinize their use more so than they have before. It's costing real money from their perspective, and then they're really trying to understand the balance of patient utility, provider satisfaction, and the benefit for overall outcomes for those living with cancer. And so, particularly in oncology, which has a really interesting balance among all therapeutic areas of having a mix of acute intervention, a series of in-office follow-ups over the course of years, the use of ancillary care settings like infusion clinics and home care. It's not surprising that oncology is the space where remote patient monitoring is both seeing huge growth, but also just a huge foundation of levels of care. And so, Jeff, I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on what you've seen in the increasing use of RPM in oncology over the past, say 3 to 5 years.
Yeah, and I think what's really helpful is to kind of set the stage a little bit with RPM in general and like recognize that RPM for 2018 really didn't exist in a significant way. I think what's interesting is whereas that area was really dominated with more chronic disease management, meaning like patients with hypertension, hypercholesteremia, you would see diabetes, COPD. What we're now seeing is as a percentage of the clinicians using this, oncology is actually one of the few sectors that's growing right now. So whereas we're seeing actually less of a percentage of the specialists being cardiologists or for cardiovascular purposes, and what we're seeing is really oncology is actually one of the areas where we're seeing that increase. And I think part of that's because oncology is an area where they've been doing remote monitoring, maybe not in the reimbursement sense or in the way CMS might define remote patient monitoring, but they've been monitoring patients for years and keeping in touch with them between chemo treatments, radiation, everything. So it's something they've always been very good at. I think now as they're finding a way to more do it mechanistically and in a way that actually gets them the appropriate reimbursement, which becomes an iterative cycle of, hey, there's ways for us to get paid more. It's better for patients as well. It's kind of a win-win.
Gotcha. Ned, I'm interested in your perspective as well, because Jeff and I tend to come at this from the digital side and in some cases the care delivery side. You coming from the scientist perspective and from the therapeutic manufacturer's perspective, how are they starting to think about how early in the clinical and commercial development are pharmaceutical companies thinking about remote patient monitoring?
Yeah, I think it's very different if we're talking about a clinical development case versus a commercial case. So in terms of clinical development, they have recognized the value of tracking digital biomarkers for some time. I think it is one of the clearest, most obvious, well-worn use cases for tracking these patients, understanding exactly the ancillary care that they need as they navigate oftentimes very toxic chemotherapy regimens. And it is very clear that those patients are going to stay more involved in trials. They are going to stay on therapy longer, and correspondingly practices will have significantly less resource utilization and resource requirements if those patients can be more effectively followed and tracked. From the commercial side, I think it is much more challenging for those developers to have a clear ROI, to have a clear use case, because we just don't have many examples in the field. So you might be wanting to keep a patient on your chemotherapy and immunotherapy regimen longer, and that might play out a little bit in your clinical trial, but you have to move the needle so significantly to actually see that in terms of revenue through that drug that it becomes really hard to do on a per drug or per use case in the commercial setting.
Interesting. And how does, maybe for Jeff, as you think about the drivers of adoption, outside of sort of the clinical versus commercial use case, how much are you seeing RPM adoption change in different sites of care? How much are you seeing it in the hospital, in the clinic, in the home, in places like pharmacy? Are you seeing big differences there?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are areas, and again, it depends if you're saying RPM as like the reimbursement, like insurance definition, or as kind of remote monitoring in terms of just being able to interact with the patient in two different places, right? From different places where the practitioner is versus where the patient is. By the reimbursement definition, it is all basically home use for the most part. And it is very much either based through these RPM companies like HRS, 100 Plus, whoever, or HealthSnap, or it is done through, a lot of times, through the health system itself, like directly. They're doing some homegrown things as well. I think what we're finding is that now, if you're talking about remote monitoring of a patient, I think that's going to happen more and more in oncology, whereas we've seen it in neuro and mental behavioral health in acute care or subacute care settings where post-surgery. We may even see acute care hospital at home or surgical for some of these patients, post-mastectomy, things like that. So I think that opens up a whole completely different world once you get into more medical interventions and remote monitoring in that sense. Following up on what Ned said, though, I do think that the commercial use case for these digital measures is challenging. But I think, to Ned's point, if biopharma companies can find a way to either keep patients on their drugs, and the digital measures are incredibly cost effective as a solution, and if that can be incorporated into RPM, either the insurance or the non-insurance definition, well, then it becomes a more interesting value proposition and a little bit more compelling, I think.
Gotcha. Interesting. So let's dig a little bit more into the sort of the patient journey and the product journey as you think about some of the manufacturers. Where do you see the greatest impact across the patient journey? Can you describe some of the points where RPM, either just as an activity or as a reimbursement scheme, where it's having the most impact, whether that's onboarding or active monitoring or refinement and escalation?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think if you ask different people, you get different answers. And we've done work in the past. Greg and I actually did a project where we were actually building personas of patients and clinicians to try to understand where in the journey and what problem using remote patient monitoring would solve for them. And what I think is that I think it's actually quite helpful, to Ned's point, when they're going through a difficult treatment regimen, or even just a standard treatment regimen that, difficult's a little bit relative. It's all going to be difficult, right? And I think when they're going through something and they're likely to experience side effects, I personally think that that's where patients see the most value. I think that's also where the digital measures come in too, because some of them are ePROs, electronic patient-reported outcomes, and some of them are actually objective measures of something that was typically captured subjectively. So I think for patients either way, for some of them, it becomes a standardized way for them to track the side effects or adverse events, or just in general, how they're feeling. And I think that there's some comfort to that also then goes right back to the doctor's office. So whereas I think sometimes in our research, we're like, people may call the doctor, they may send it through the EMR. You don't always know who you're getting it. And sometimes I think patients had questions of, oh, is this actually getting reviewed and whatnot? I think through some of these RPM services or through the homegrown ones, I think having the objective data and knowing that it's going to your practitioner, especially if they bill for it, you 100% know it's going to your practitioner. I think that's comforting, and it adds another level of wraparound service to the care.
And how much does remote patient monitoring have an effect during sort of the early diagnosis and sort of treatment decision phase versus when you're in active treatment versus as you get into survivorship? Where do you see remote monitoring playing the biggest role?
Man, I don't know if you disagree with me on this. I could see it once, not that there's not a use case for it prior to or kind of during the diagnostic process, but because some patients may be relatively asymptomatic. There are symptoms, obviously, with different types of cancer, right? But I do see it more as in treatment and also with survivorship. That's where I see it being more valuable. Survivorship, I think we have to be cautious about as well. Not because it's not useful, but because it's also a constant reminder. Now, that being said, I think it is useful. I think it's figuring out a way that interacts with patients and clinicians that is useful to them, which maybe doesn't meet the reimbursement definition, but is also not intrusive at this point. Once you're on the other side.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, and that those are the clearest use cases and the strongest value proposition today, right? When a patient knows they're going to be on chemotherapy, they know there's significant toxicity associated with it, you're going to need care at some point, and you want to clearly track how you're feeling and send that directly to a care team that can help, right? I think that's the most obvious use case today. And I think we're going to start seeing more and more use cases a little earlier too. I think the survivorship, I agree with you. I think there's a use case there, but I think where we're going to see the field evolve is to start to pull that earlier and earlier and thinking about treatment planning, incorporating other biomarkers, other ways to assess patient fitness, likelihood of responding to different therapies, likelihood of tolerating different therapies. As we just build more robust data packages that look, at something broader than just, tumor burden and the drugs we know are most effective against that tumor site or molecular subtype.
Gotcha. Interesting. Well, okay, let's talk a little bit more about digital biomarkers, digital measures. From the biopharma manufacturer perspective, can you tell us a little bit more about what these RPM solutions are actually producing and how pharma companies are using them, both in the clinical and the commercial use cases? I think that's probably for Ned.
Oh, sorry. I can too, but Ned, please go ahead.
Okay, I will start, and Jeffy, you jump in. Yeah, and so what I have seen are a handful of more acute cases and use cases where they might be associated with a specific therapy or a specific class of therapy. So CAR-Ts are a great example where those are known to be associated with cytokine release syndrome and ICANS, and those toxicities have to be managed very carefully and very closely. And when those drugs first reached the market, right, those patients were treated inpatient. Now we are starting to move to a model where those can be managed outpatient, and RPMs are hugely valuable for being able to do that. But for the most part, we've seen broader use in trying to understand likelihood of responding to a treatment. There are some predictive algorithms where people have looked at a variety of measures to try to predict that and understand that. We have looked at more common response to treatment measures. But I think for the most part, you tend to see applications within clinical development designed to keep patients on clinical trials and as comfortable as possible while they're on those trials. And usually that means those patients who are on chemotherapy or similarly toxic regimens, because we know the earlier you intervene, the better off those patients are going to be, right? And so you will have simpler solutions for those patients. They are likely to stay on more complicated, more toxic regimens. The requirements for administration are becoming more onerous as you're having more overlapping different types of therapies. So anything that can ease that burden for those patients is incredibly valuable. And developers have seen that and the value of that use case, I think, a little better than they have some of those other use cases at this point.
Interesting. Jeff, anything to add?
Yeah, I think I agree with everything that said. I think he's 100% right. I think the other thing not to lose sight of is also that even the standard vitals or tracking things like sleep, ADLs, mobility, function, having an objective measure of those items as well, I think is not only helpful from a clinical trial standpoint, I think that is also helpful when you're looking at the kind of the holistic health of the patient and their well-being. Things like nausea, GI symptoms, even pain. I think these things will become more and more as they're being used more and more in clinical trials, whether they be secondary or primary endpoints, which, in this situation, right, that's not going to be the primary endpoint, but a secondary endpoints, or maybe as part of like a safety set of endpoints for primary. Like, I think there you get to a point where it's like, yes, I think they become also very, very useful. Like if you can say, well, if you use our product, your ADLs or your level functioning stays here, as opposed to with the competitors, it's here. Well, that's a different way to look at the value proposition that maybe you typically wouldn't before. So I think it also enables actually in some ways a new way to look at how marketing can be done or the benefits of a drug can be expressed.
I know there's always been skepticism around ROI, in clinical development and commercial use of digital measures. And Jeff, I know you've done some work with the Digital Medicine Society around an ROI calculator. Can you talk a little bit more about sort of what goes into thinking about ROI for better or worse around the use of digital measures?
Yeah. So, I mean, in a nutshell, which if anybody watching this knows how hard that is for me to do, I'm going to try to speak really succinctly. Essentially, what we're saying is digital measures, because of the fact that oftentimes we're converting something that was subjective into objective, or because of the fact of the reliability, and it takes out some of the variability of reaching out to people via phone, or you lost track of them, it's always there. I think there's a chance that actually you're able to reduce either the number of participants or the length of your study because you're using digital measures. So working with Dime, who had worked with Professor Damasi at Tufts, and wrote a wonderful article about this, we were able to develop a calculator that looked at the NPV. And in some situations, right, the NPV went from maybe negative to positive, or it went negative and it stayed negative, but it actually improved. In essence, it got closer to zero than it had been. So either way, through that process, what we saw was that pretty much the ubiquitous use of digital measures improved the NPV of those projects, of those clinical trials.
Gotcha. Okay. No, that's really interesting. Let's shift gears a little bit and think about, as pharma companies are thinking about how to implement RPM programs, both for reimbursement reasons, but also just for better patient outcome and communication reasons. How are they thinking about whether this is something that they should be building on their own, something they should be partnering with an existing vendor to white label and deliver to the market? And how much are they just truly just paying other vendors to do this on their behalf?
So it's a pretty complicated strategic question, and I believe that one of the most critical things is the breadth of the portfolio and the number of products for which these will be relevant. I think what we've seen is it's really hard to make a financial case if it is for one therapy, just based on the investment required, based on the expertise required, based on everything they have to typically build from scratch for a bespoke case, which is usually the therapy they're trying to support. If you have a broader portfolio and you think that, okay, this is actually going to be relevant for 5 products as opposed to 1, that makes the argument much easier. And as we see certain modalities, T-cell engagers, bispecifics continue to grow, I think you're going to have stronger arguments to be made, but it can be tough to pick and choose the right spot to start to develop some of these.
I think the implementation part of this, which is part of what it's alluding to, right? I think it can be costly. I think, what's interesting, Greg, is I think a great way to look at the space is look at the direct-to-patient DTP pharmacies that we're seeing from Roche announced they're thinking about it now, or they're probably going to do it, which means it's probably in process. Lilly, Pfizer. I think what's going to be really interesting is I work with a National Council Prescription Drug Programs task group lead. And I know that pharmacists there are already thinking about how they can leverage RPM as a complement to their clinical practice and how they interact with patients. So I think, Greg, when it comes to like build, buy, partner, I don't think we've seen all the iterations of the model as it's going to work today. And I think that the companies that are very big in the space right now, again, I mentioned one earlier, HRS. I think the companies like that, where they already have a base in cardiovascular care, sure, maybe they could. Or if you look at companies like Navigating Cancer, Jasper, other ones that specialize in oncology, they have a slightly different business model. But again, I don't really know to Ned's point how much money they're necessarily going to make from it in the traditional reimbursement sense. Now, that being said, Biopharma also sometimes has internal hubs, or they may do a white label pharmacy, which is what we're seeing with the DTP pharmacies. I'm very interested to see how those come into play. Because their RPM may not be the main business, but as a complement to their current business, and because they already have potentially the requisite healthcare practitioners that they may need, that could be very, very interesting. So I think the models of the future that are going to happen, we don't quite know yet. I think biopharma is going to be what drives some of that innovation. They will do it quietly. Nobody will know who did it or why necessarily, which is neither here nor there. But I think that it does, again, kind of be like, I think there's a build. And we've often talked about into IDTS, diagnostic testing facilities, independent diagnostic testing facilities, and how interesting would it be for biopharma someday to set one of these up? I think, does that also become something that either is set up by the pharmacy or by Roche had coagu-checked IDTFs for PTI&R testing? I don't know that this is any different, but to Ned's point, I think it works better if they have multiple drug portfolios or multiple pipelines in different therapeutic areas, as opposed to we have one drug and then we're going to invest in building this. So again, I think the future is quite open-ended in a good way.
I think it's also really hard from an adoption standpoint as a practice. You're not going to want to adopt one new tool for one drug, right? You really want something that addresses all of your patients, any therapy, any treatment needs they have, right? And so you have to get to scale to actually justify the investment from the practices, which is kind of a chicken or an egg situation.
So, Ned, can I ask you a question then? Sorry, Greg. Do you think that it's going to be companies? So if you're targeting one specific type of cancer versus you are targeting even a handful of different types of oncology indications, do you think that makes it easier? Because again, speaking specifically to the oncologist, it's like, okay, now I don't have to just use this in my practice for one doctor who specializes in liver or one doctor who specializes in breast.
Yes, especially since so much of the value of this is in a community practice, right? And those oncologists are managing every type of cancer under the sun, right? And you just think about the likelihood of having a prostate, breast, lung, colorectal, right? A lot of medical oncologists are treating many of those as opposed to someone who is hyper-focused on liver cancer, for instance.
And so it sounds like I'm curious, both of your thoughts on where the current barriers exist. It sounds like it's not a technology problem, and it's not even necessarily a business problem, a business model problem. It still is around, what is the role of different stakeholders and who is, who's really taking the lead in some of these areas, and how do they bring sort of their counterparties together? Do you think that's fair, or is there more to it than that?
So I think Ned brought up also a really good point that I would add to what you mentioned, Greg, which is internally, I've kind of said the war for the front door, and meaning the war for the front door of the hospital or the community center. And so I do still think that as this is going on, do I have to have an integration with another company? Can I just use the company that's doing RPM for me for COPD? I think those are issues. I think there are really interesting moves like we just saw recently, Zelf and Samsung, that acquisition slash partnership, where Zelf has access to, I think, 500 hospitals and I think 70 some health systems. And I think what that does is that creates a lot of opportunity for what we also, I think, is not only just RPM, but also the convergence of probably things like hospital at home and RPM, which is another podcast probably. But I do think that today is still an issue, is integration, is getting it spun up, is the fact that is costly and time consuming for health systems and especially community practices. I think that's what we still haven't solved yet. I think that's partially because we just haven't gotten to a point where there's a winner of who owns the front door to the clinical, or how many different companies own the front door to the healthcare system.
Gotcha.
I completely agree with that. I think it is the growth in the clinical data behind the true value of these use cases for patients, right, that needs to align with just scale that will allow, a practice to say, okay, this is already, part of my EMR system. It's in every room here. It's relevant for most patients I see, or a large percentage of them. And this is just how we manage patients more effectively. And it's really hard until you reach that scale, until you reach that ease of use, because we know how hard it is to try to commercialize one of these if you have to go practice by practice or clinician by clinician.
Interesting. That's great. Okay. Really interesting. Well, as we start to wrap up, I'd be curious for, the two of you who spend a lot of time in this space, what are the maybe 2 to 3 trends that you're interested in or excited about that are going to drive future growth in the use of digital health in oncology, broadly? Maybe Jeff, why don't we start with you?
So I think there's a few. One, I do think that obviously the sheer growth in RPM, remote therapeutic monitoring, and the significant utilization of chronic care management. That's one trend that we are watching very closely, because at the end of the day, the U.S. healthcare system, for all its imperfections, one thing we do, and its unpredictability, one thing we do know is that if there's a way for health systems and community practitioners to generate extra reimbursement because their margins are slow, and that happens to align with what's best for patients, that's where you start to see things really start to move. And again, seeing RPM grow from a couple 100,000 units billed in 2018 to, I think it was 16.5 million in 2024. Tiny compared to like the 8 billion claims or billions of claims, but enormous growth. And CCM had a very similar path as well, where it's, I think, over 30 plus million. So I think we'll keep watching that. And I think that the other thing I would say I'm really watching for is, I don't know, having talked to executives at, HRS, HealthSnap, Jasper, Aptar, all these other companies, or on the digital measure side, like VivaSense, Actigraph, over the years, right? Clinical, all these companies over the years, I think I'm very interested that, like, especially in the RPM space, how many of these companies intended to have their business model end up where it is now. And in digital, it's very common for things to switch and for you to figure out that the way I thought I was going to operate is not the way that I ended up operating. So I think as I look towards the future, I do actually look at that biopharma-led model, or more IPTFs, or pharmacy being a lot more involved in this, in oncology and in other use cases. That's a trend that I'm going to keep very closely. I think it's possible that it gets decentralized more than it is today.
Ned, what about you?
I spent a lot of time thinking about different modalities and classes of therapies and the impact those will have on technologies like RPMs. And one clear trend I see is amazing growth in antibody drug conjugates, growth in radioligand therapies. And these classes of drugs have different toxicity profiles, right? And so we are learning that, okay, as more and more ADCs take off, more and more clinicians are going to need support with handling ocular toxicity, right? When they might not have an ophthalmologist on staff, right? Getting really comfortable with different toxicity profiles. And I think because of that, we're starting to see the access to novel therapies and that difference between the top academic centers and a small private practice be magnified. And if the sponsors truly want to maximize their revenues, maximize utilization of these products that are amazing in many cases, they have to increase that access more toward community practices. And for those community practices to be able to handle the new demands with these toxicity profiles, they have to adopt new technologies, exactly like RPM. So I think that will be a big driver as well, as we see oncologists need to become more comfortable managing a wider range of unfamiliar toxicity profiles.
Great. And speaking of new technologies, we certainly can't, with anything related to digital health, we can't ignore the impact of artificial intelligence on this. As you look at, pre-COVID, there was a huge amount of investment in clinical decision support for oncology that largely didn't work, just because of the volume of new treatments and literature coming out literally every day that oncologists and community caregivers couldn't keep up with it. And even the rules-based systems couldn't keep up with it. And they largely did not succeed. And I think we're seeing over the next couple of years, as large language models and generative AI are really obviously are here to stay, I think we are going to see the promise of some of those initial companies really coming to fruition in this whole host of remote patient monitoring and clinical decision support that we'll, I think, all be keeping a close eye on.
Yeah, Greg, I think the precision is what's going to also increase significantly. So I think not only but if patients have to switch drugs, I think you'll find out sooner. If a patient needs a dose titration, you'll find out sooner. And so I think what this means is, in an ideal world, is you actually get better outcomes over time. Like, not just happier patients because they're not having the side effects that they otherwise could and they're not quite as severe, but I think you actually get to the relevant clinical dose that's needed. Because I think, Ned, you know this area better than I do, but I think it's a balance between what's the best clinical dose that you can tolerate the side effects at, but also treats your cancer. And I think that actually will get better, Greg, partially because of AI and the capturing of objective data. We all know garbage in, garbage out when it comes to data. Well, I'm not saying that all subjective data is garbage, but it's imperfect because it's somebody thinking about it and interpreting it. If we're able to use vision, speech, smell, sleep, as a way to measure a patient's progress or how the side effects are, it just means we'll get better outcomes. And so eventually, I'd love to see survivorship go up. And that would be the ideal scenario. And I think that's also why governments and insurers need to make sure they keep supporting this. It may be tough today. It may be costing them a lot today. And I think they're a little unsure sometimes about what it's being used for because they don't necessarily have all that clarity unless they audit. There is a very bright future ahead for these products in oncology, and we should do everything we can not to stifle that.
Which seems like a great note to end on. Thank you, Ned. Thank you, Jeff, for joining me today. For our viewers, please leave any comments if you have any follow-up questions, and we'll get Ned and Jeff back on the horn to answer them directly. Then coming up over the next couple months, we're going to have a couple more topics in this series on cross-sector oncology, including insights from our precision medicine team on minimal residual disease, and then from both our biopharma and our medical device team on radioligands and drug device combos. So stay tuned for that, and we look forward to talking to you soon. Thanks very much.